Could you imagine what it would be like to have your school, just after you take over it, or company, or any group, to be merged with another one shortly after you've done that? And even more importantly, moved to another organization and not where you first started. Can you imagine what the culture would be like and how you would address it? Hey, everybody, Dr. Jones, and this week's episode of Seeing to Lead with Vicki Wilson talks about just that. You see, Vicki was in that position, and so she decided to take a tact that some people may not have. It all had to do with perception and perspective. You see, perspective matters so much because it just doesn't matter how we see people, but ultimately how they see themselves. And the way you do that is by working from a strengths-based perspective instead of thinking about deficits. You see, when you see people, you don't pick out what could be better. You pick out what they're strong in, and then you find other strengths in other people, and you put them together, and before you know it, you have moments and pockets of strength that become a movement, an overwhelming culture of strength. That takes a switching of your own perspective so that others may follow. And that is what this episode is about. Vicki did a fantastic job of this, and wait till you hear how she took the culture, improved it from the grassroots up. But don't take it from me. Let's hear from Vicki Wilson on Seeing to Lead.
Let her kids display what she was doing. And it wasn't even a directed lesson. It was, we came in and saw the kids like going from board to board, dialoguing with each other and challenging each other. And it had tremendous impact on everybody. And I think what a shame it might have been if for her entire career, that practice only happened in her classroom and no one ever knew about it except for the children.
Dr. Chris Jones here, and welcome to Seeing to Lead, a show designed to help leaders increase their ability to effectively support, engage, and empower their staff through intentional practices so that they create an environment where everyone reaches their greatest level of success. On Seeing to Lead, communication rules the day as we hear voices from both teachers and leaders in an effort to examine perspectives, highlight misunderstandings, and provide steps to ultimately bridge the gap between what teachers need and provide through thoughtful dialogue. This show is about amplifying voices, creating understanding, and providing information to help everyone continually improve. I want to personally thank you for taking the time. Now, let's get to getting better.
Vicki Wilson is an educator, author, consultant, and professional development presenter who has served children and educators for over 30 years as a teacher and principal. She is passionate about education, especially about adult learning and the value or impact it has on student learning. Vicki's interests include educator learning, leadership, organizational change, progressive and innovative practices in education, and leveraging best practices at school to make an improvement so that all students get the best possible education. Vicki is especially proud of the journey she took as a 16-year principal, where she led a school through a closing and merger, instituted a strength-based approach to instructional rounds, empowering teachers to learn and grow from each other's strengths, and eventually led her school to become a nationally recognized Model PLC School by Solution Tree. Under Vicki's leadership, Monroe became known as a student-centered school that values both student and adult collaborative learning. In 2020, Vicki published Lead with Instructional Rounds, creating a culture of professional learning, a Lead Like a Pirate guidebook with Dave Burgess Consulting. This book shares the journey of a difficult school merger and how it healed and grew into a healthy school culture using a unique school-centered approach to instructional rounds. In 2021, Vicki was part of a 100-author collaboration to write 100 no-nonsense things that all teachers should stop doing and 100 no-nonsense things that all administrators should stop doing, both published by Pushing Boundaries Consulting. Currently, Vicki trains and develops schools to implement her grassroots approach to instructional rounds with a strength-focused lens that empowers school staff to learn and grow from and with each other. She also works with Solution Tree as an associate to deliver professional development in professional learning communities at work. Consults and leads professional learning with schools and districts through the transition and change process associated with school closings and mergers, and coaches and mentors school leaders. Vicki enjoys connecting with a professional learning network through Twitter chats, blogs, and events. I'm excited to talk to Vicki today. So Vicki, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris, for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
You know, Vicki, in reading through your bio, that's quite the bio. And I'm familiar with Dave Burgess Publishing and Consulting, and I've read the books 100 No-Nonsense Things, and I really like them. So it's really interesting that we've come into contact after me hearing you on another podcast to be able to talk about these things that you write about and, more importantly, even live in your practice each day.
Thank you. I'm really excited to have that conversation with you today.
So talk to me about something in your bio that really interested me when I was reading through that, is the idea of leveraging those best practices around schools to improve the experience for everybody involved. What does that look like? And what do you mean by leveraging best practices?
You know, when I think of leveraging, I think of how are we sharing this work and utilizing it across our school as a common practice. And when we think of the structure of schools, there's so much isolation in the way schools are built and the way they're structured and the way we even set them up with individual classrooms and a teacher and four walls. And so when I talk about leveraging best practices, is how do we, once we learn about our practices and best instructional practices and what research says about it and what the science says about it and what the art of best practices are, and we start utilizing them in our classrooms, how do we share that so it goes from classroom to classroom and we can start leveraging these practices across our school?
So it's important that you talk about the isolation piece. And typically people talk more about isolation the higher up you go in school. So you get into those secondary levels and you separate those content areas. You see it at the lower levels too, but especially at the high school levels. How do you break down that isolation? Or how did you go about breaking down that isolation?
Well, you know, I started reading about different ways that we can get teachers into each other's classrooms. Actually, I'm going to back that up even further to when I first became a principal. I had the benefit of becoming a principal in the school that I had taught at for 3 years prior to becoming that principal there. And the first thing that struck me, you know, I was really excited to get into classrooms and start talking about teaching and learning with teachers and observing and having conversations about instruction. And when I got into those classrooms of my colleagues, my friends, my people I knew, I was just blown away how for these years I had no idea what was happening inside their classroom. Or I would see something that they were doing that was amazing. And I had no idea, after working with them for years, that they had this act of amazing that they were doing with kids. And I got really excited, but also started contemplating, like, how can I get other teachers to be a fly on a wall in each other's classrooms the way I'm suddenly getting to do now being their principal? And I don't think that had I gone into a school where I didn't know the people that I had been working with, if I would have even discovered that or realized it. So that was what really struck me by becoming a principal where I was already working, is I had no idea what was happening in those classrooms. And the other thing that I actually felt bad about is I also had preconceived notions on what I expected it would be like when I went there that were many times unfair. And that's just based on maybe, you know, walking down the hallways or conversations in the lounge. And so, you know, I went in and realized that a lot of my preconceived thoughts were not valid or justified, or also that there were these greatnesses happening that I didn't know were happening. And how can we leverage that across the school? So that's really where it all started. And so then I started reading and learning and, you know, reading about walkthroughs or instructional rounds and trying to figure out, and I even shared with my staff right away, like, I'm blown away coming into your classrooms and there's so much greatness and I'm so excited to learn with you. And I want to figure out a way that we can make this happen. And it did take me a long time to get there, but eventually we did get there. But I really had to shift it quite a bit.
I was just going to say, it took a long time to get there. Get where? Getting people to do those things with you, or?
It took a long time, probably about 5 years after becoming a principal, where I actually had a system and a structure in place in order to do that. And that in itself was a journey that played into the approach we ended up taking 5 years down the road. So after I became a principal, year one was really great. You know, it's kind of like a honeymoon year, and getting in and talking about instruction and also kind of brewing in my head, how can I get us into each other's classroom? Not really sure how to solve that yet. Year two, I had the blessing of having twin babies. So I had a little bit of a maternity leave there and was overwhelmed about a whole lot of things with the 2-year-old and twin babies suddenly and a brand new principal. So we didn't execute it that year either. When I got back from maternity leave, so, I think around January, my superintendent met with me upon my return and shared with me that at the end of that school year, we would be closing our elementary school and merging it with another elementary school that was nearby in our district, and that principal would be retiring. So I would be the principal of these two schools together, and it would be at the location of the other school. What I learned quickly is that our two schools, McKinley and Monroe, operated very differently. They were kind of polar opposite in the way that they worked. And so that provided a lot of challenges. I knew that both schools were on a journey to learn more about instructional practices. That was a goal, but they also operated very differently. One was what I call kind of like a kumbaya school, and just really happy and sing-alongs and just making sure that the kids were loved and happy. And we definitely needed to grow instructional practices, but we were really good at making sure everybody was happy. And then the school we were merging with, when I, started to get over there and start planning, I learned that it was much more regimented. So an example I like to share is getting ready for the opening of this school year, and in the office, just with the secretary, and the bells started going off, and I'm listening and I'm hearing the bells, and there was a morning bell, and then there were bells happening throughout the lunchtime, and then there was the 3:00 bell, and 15 minutes later, there was another bell. And I called out to my secretary and I'm like, what was that bell for? And she said, well, that's the teacher dismissal bell. And I'm like, there's a teacher dismissal bell. And I said, do all the teachers then get up and leave at that time? And she's like, yeah. And it was just very, very different. Or when school started opening, the teachers scheduled appointments to talk to me instead of walking in to my office and just saying, hey. So it was, like I said, very, very different. And bringing these two groups of adults together to thrive in a learning culture together was a huge challenge. And, school number one felt like they lost their school and their home and all of that. But they were coming over together. But school number two felt like they were taking over because, not only are you coming into our school, but you're bringing your leader that you've had for 2 years with you. So they felt very much like they weren't going to be listened to or heard, or that wasn't really their leader. So it was quite a divide. That first few years probably took about 10 years off of my life. It was really hard to work with adults in that setting and trying to bring them together and unite around some common ideas and understandings and norms. And mind you, I was only a second-year principal and I did not know what I was doing yet. And I had 2 newborn babies and I wasn't sleeping very well at night. Like, it was so hard, but still in the back of my mind, there was always this brewing going on. Like, how do I get teachers into each other's classrooms? But I put it away because we had much bigger problems to deal with, like just trying to unite everybody and be on the same page and having a school improvement plan and all that. So eventually in time, and it took a few years and a little bit of a push, like I had some teachers saying, hey, I want to go in and see how this person is doing math rounds. We were trying to like play around with doing math rounds, like reading rounds or like a daily five math. Can you relieve us so that we can get in and see each other? And I was so grateful they said that. So I'm like, yes, I am going to do that. And we're going to do it in a structured way with something that's just been percolating in my head for years. And we're going to do it instructional round style. And what I meant by that is I'll take you all as a group and we will look at one class and how they're doing it for 10 minutes. We'll step outside and then we'll dialogue about the positive things that we saw happening in that classroom and the impact that was having on students around that idea of math and how it was structured and how that was working. And then we'll go into another one of the classrooms, observe for 10 minutes, and we're going to come out and then we're going to dialogue around best practices there, what was working, what was the positives. And so the structure that ended up coming out of it was 10 minutes in a room, 5 minutes of dialogue around a reflective question that brought about positive practices. And we did that 4 times. So 4 rooms, 5-minute dialogues. And then we ended with a much larger reflection process where we really reflected on what we saw and with seeing that, what's validating the work that we're doing in our own classrooms. And then also, what did we see that we would like to take and grow from and try in the work that we're doing? And that was a way of spreading those best practices. So in doing that, there was a bit of a flip on a couple of the ideas of instructional rounds in order to make it work with this merger. And one is that it's not looking for a deficit or a problem to fix. We're looking for the strengths that are happening and how we can spread and leverage those. And the other thing is that it wasn't a top-down initiative, but it's grassroots. This is us in our school, and we want to go in and see what's working in each other's classrooms and start to talk about it and spread those practices around our school. And that's really where it all started. And it just kind of took that merger. What ended up happening in the merger, so we did it just as that experiment around math daily 5 rounds. And then from there, we started to just use it generally. Like, we're just going to go into each other's classrooms, look for positives, talk about it, validate our work. And we started not to see ourselves as 2 different teams anymore, 2 different entities, but we started to talk about each other through the strengths of what was happening in each of our classrooms with our students. And we would start talking about the impact those practices would have on those students. And out of that came that structure of a strength-focused instructional rounds, but really a grassroots style.
Supporting your teachers and students seems to be a struggle. They just don't seem to be engaged. You wish they would take more responsibility for their learning and culture of the building, but they just don't seem to be empowered enough to do it. So, my question is, have you checked out the book Seeing to Lead yet? It's all about creating a true educational experience where learning, growth, leadership, and community take center stage. Full of strategies and resources, Seeing to Lead is about attaining that goal by employing a model that supports, engages, and empowers all individuals to become leaders themselves. Pick up a copy today at seeingtolead.com. That's seeingtolead.com. Remember, You don't become a leader and then decide you need to support and recognize others more than yourself. It is the moment you realize it's about supporting and recognizing others that you become a leader. SeeingToLead.com.
So you just said a ton there, and I'm sitting here, I've got so many questions.
I did. That was a mouthful. Thanks for listening for that long.
Look, the listeners are going to benefit from that. It's like you just gave a little bit of a class on how to get instructional rounds started, but better than, I would argue, which maybe is why you won that award for your school, better than the typical instructional rounds that we hear. Because you mentioned a couple things that are really important. You mentioned the grassroots. It started from the bottom, and people did it because and that creates a vested interest in it. And then you talked about strengths-based. Boy, if we could just do everything every day, focusing on the strengths instead of highlighting the deficiencies, we would go so much further. Because, and I mean, there's tons of books on this, but the idea that once you're highlighting a deficiency and trying to fix a deficiency, you can only improve that deficiency. That's going to be a tough word for me to keep saying, so maybe I better move away from it. You can only strengthen that deficiency so much to a certain point. If somebody's good at skill A and you're not that good at skill A, well, if they work on skill A, they're going to get that much better. You're never even going to reach maybe where they were before, where it might be the flip for you with skill B, where you're strong in that. So why not highlight their strengths, and then you can put people that complement each other together and turn that whole merger into a positive thing, which it sounds like that's what you did.
It really did. Once we started doing that, just the divide between the two staffs completely crumbled, and so fast. Like for 3 years, I've been working really hard and, trying to having staff meetings and professional learning and, let's look at our personalities and how we fit together and doing some of those personality quizzes, which I think are also very beneficial. But it wasn't until that we could see each of the people on our staff, like doing what they love and they're passionate about with their students, and see them in that role, which we don't engage with them ever in that way with the way schools are structured. But once we could see them being passionate about teaching and doing what they love and making a difference with their students, and then coming out and only talking about what we saw positively. So we're only framing the work in a positive way and the strengths that they have. It changed everything. And we really didn't have two sides anymore. And then teachers would go, they want to learn more. They got that 10-minute glimpse, but they want to learn more. So now they're starting to talk to each other. Well, how did you set that up? Like, how did that, where did you begin with that? And so I'd often see them going and learning more from each other. And that's constantly happening. Some other benefits are we started to develop a common vocabulary on our staff, but not even just the vocabulary, but a common understanding of that. So think about the word rigor. Do we all really know what that is? Do we all have a common understanding of what it is? Or does rigor mean something different from class A to B to C to D? And if we can have a professional development about depth of knowledge and rigor, and then, it's time for instructional rounds. And as the facilitator, if I see an example of a depth of knowledge 3, then I can pose a question around that. And we could talk about the strengths of how that teacher got those kids to a depth of knowledge 3. And that's what rigor really looks like. Or another one, this was a real life example. We were, we had had a training on rigor maybe a year or a year and a half prior to this. And we're in a classroom, and it was a math class. And the kids were engaged around kind of a big problem, a messy problem that they had to come up with some strategies. And there's more than one answer to the question. And they were struggling with it. And in their struggle, having a lot of really good math dialogue. And so when we stepped out to have our dialogue around best practices, we started talking about productive struggle and how that was an evidence of rigor in that classroom. So now we are starting to, we're calibrating what rigor is, because, and this was a training we had well over a year ago, but we're still talking about it. So all the learning we've done professionally stays living if you're regularly doing this work of instructional rounds and finding the strengths of implementation in classrooms.
That's fantastic. And the idea of continuing to practice is not a one and done type of thing, which we always know and say. But something that came up that was really interesting to me is the idea of perspective. And you mentioned it a little bit at the beginning, where one school, it was like they were moving over into this different atmosphere. The other school, it was like the other school was coming and taking over. So people had those different perspectives. And then you talk about when you go into a classroom, when teachers go see other teachers, it's really easy to have a preconceived notion or to have a certain perspective about that teacher. That teacher does this or that teacher does that. And we personalize our practice. We try not to, but we do to an extent. But to then go into the classrooms like you're talking about and change those preconceived notions so that perspectives are changed. And then you start to see these people in a different light. And then even a step further, when you talk about perspective, the perspective of different definitions of, like you used rigor, for an example, that common language piece where now everybody's operating from the same perspective on what quality instruction looks like and what improvement looks like in the classroom. That's such a powerful thing, all from having people go around and do instructional rounds and continue that work.
Absolutely. Wow. Thank you for saying that.
There's no question there, but it's just something.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're completely right. And here's another story that reminds me of is I have a teacher who's really an introvert, and she was a veteran teacher, very, very introverted. So when she started opening her classroom for instructional rounds, what was amazing is I think there was a perception of that she was withdrawn a lot and didn't share a lot in staff meetings or professional development. But when we went into her room, when she opened it up, and that came when she was comfortable, like I've always done it, when you're ready, you'll volunteer for it. It's never a forced thing and it really isn't a grassroots effort anymore. So when she was comfortable and started doing it, it kind of blew everybody away. Now, I'd been in her classroom plenty of times, so I was prepared for it. Like I knew what she does with kids, but the rest of our staff really didn't. And so when she opened up her room, this veteran teacher, she had such a grasp on the 4 C's of 21st century learning, and nobody was expecting that from her. And I went in her classroom, and every student team had their own large whiteboard space. So every time they would go into any kind, she'd pose a question and they go into brainstorming, or they're creating a visual display around whatever challenge she gave them. And then they started rotating to each other's board to talk about that and give feedback to the next team. And they went around the room, and it was not an instructional practice that anybody had been using. And we stepped out, and then I posed a reflective question around the 4 C's of 21st century learning. Let's talk about each of them and what you saw in the classroom today. And it was amazing. And the perception, like everybody in that group now had over that teacher that really had never shared her practices before, only because it's her style. She's just such an introvert, was able to let her kids display what she was doing. And it wasn't even a directed lesson. It was, we came in and saw the kids like going from board to board, dialoguing with each other and challenging each other. And it had tremendous impact on everybody. And I think what a shame it might have been if for her entire career, that practice only happened in her classroom and no one ever knew about it except for the children.
That is so well said. What a shame that would have been. Well, that's it for part 1. Make sure you tune into part 2 next week. Like I said, Vicki had so much to teach us about all things being positive, not focusing on deficits, so we can try and leverage people's strengths. The idea that, solid, successful systems take time to build, and as you've heard many times on this show, must start with culture. Those initiatives that we do, they need to be grassroots if they're going to be successful. Look, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to Seeing to Lead, and I ask you a favor. If what you heard was valuable, don't hesitate to share it, subscribe, or leave a rating and review so other people can benefit from it too. Even better, share your biggest takeaway and tag me on social media. Have a great week, and I promise you're going to enjoy part 2 just as much, if not more, next week when Vicki finishes up her interview on Seeing to Lead.
Well, that's a wrap, but not the end. Next step, be sure to take action on something you heard here today. Hey, thanks for listening to the Seeing to Lead podcast. If you would like to connect for any reason, email me at drchrisSJ@gmail.com or catch me on Twitter at Dr. C.S. Jones. If you've gotten any value from the Seeing to Lead podcast today, you can help me and other leaders create a world-class environment through a teacher-centric approach by subscribing to the show, leaving an honest rating and review, and sharing this episode on social media with your most valuable takeaway. Also, one last thing. Have you had a chance to pick up my latest 5-star rated book yet? Grab your copy of Seeing to Lead anywhere you buy books or at seeingtolead.com. That's seeingtolead.com, where you can learn more and continue to improve. Now go have a successful week.